Introduction to Theory and Philosophy lecture. My name is Julian.
I'm Jeneline.
Our
The
last
phone
guy.
is very precariously balanced, so we're just going to leave it like that.
Do you want to come into the frame? Or Jeneline is here as well. This is going to be the final lecture already in our 12-week lecture series called The Useless Precaution. However, if you're joining us for the very first time, fret not. Each of these classes is standalone. You can enjoy this as if it were your first class. It's going to be about Lacan's theory of fantasy, Zizek's theory of political ideology. It's going to be about the pervert. It's going to be about the fetish. All those things that we've talked about in the past, we're all going to wrap up into one final culminating lecture. If you're joining us for the very first time, welcome to our learning community. A year and a half ago, 2 years almost, I started hosting these classes. They're all open access. They're designed for both beginners and more advanced scholars. And the goal is to take these philosophical and psychoanalytic concepts and to make them hopefully enjoyable without dumbing them down, retaining the complexity while also making them accessible. And hopefully accessible to people from around the world. I see someone is joining us from Ethiopia, which makes me very happy. And as per usual, Jeneline has a little announcement.
Yes, Julian's current ebook is available for another couple weeks. The Where Nothing is Lacking.
Less than a couple weeks.
Less than a
I think
couple
like
weeks.
10 days or something.
Well, and I think you're actually going to have one more class this month before the next book comes out.
That's true.
Because today is we're only midway through the month, a little bit more than midway through the month. But anyway, yes, hello from Peru. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us in this sort of overcast morning. Yeah, the
We're in
ebook is
Seattle.
available. Yeah, we're in Seattle. The ebook is available for another couple of weeks. And then we'll be moving on to the next thing. We're very excited about the Useless Precaution ebook coming out. You can also join our Discord. You can read these lectures as like a PDF essay, which I find useful because sometimes the lectures go by very quickly and it's easier for me to scroll through text than to scroll through video. But that may just be me. So if you'd like to join our learning community, the information is in the bio. It's www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian.
That's right. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to balance the camera once again. And a very big thank you to Jeneline, who continues to edit the transcripts of these classes and help us put them into the form of a book, which is much appreciated. So big thank you to Jeneline, our in-house editor. And a big thank you to all of you guys for making this lecture series possible. It's been 3 months, 12 weeks of really fun, entertaining travels. We've taught these classes pretty much around Europe and the US, sort of hopping from city to city, bringing you these lectures.
But you also make it around the world, and that means a lot to us.
Yes. And so, of course, we want to thank you guys for making this possible and for joining us. And a special thank you to our patrons who continue to fund this project and to make it possible for us to do this crazy thing, which is to basically talk about philosophy and psychoanalysis and Žižek and Lacan and Kant and Hegel in a totally free and open way. So thank you guys so much. And as Jeneline said, my ebook, 5 Keys to Žižek, Where Nothing is Lacking, is still available for another 10 days or so until the end of July, after which we will hit the delete button. The book will disappear into the ether, and our subscribers will have it forever, but it will be gone. And if you are interested in joining our ebook subscription service, please just take a moment to click the link in our bio after this class, where you can find all the lecture materials based on each of these classes. Okay, I think we should simply jump right in.
Yes.
At this point. This is going to be the final class in our The Useless Precaution series. So, buckle up. We'll see. Let's see if I can pull it off. It's always hard to do the final class because we have to wrap up so many ideas. I want to start with something that I read in the newspaper that I thought was interesting. I was reading in the newspaper about a school board battle that took place somewhere in New Hampshire. And part of the school board battle was that a petition was raised to essentially defund public schooling. And part of the argument to defund public schooling was quite simple and intuitive. The argument was, why should we pay for these children to have fun? After all, education should simply be about learning. Why should we financially contribute by means of taxes to after-school activities, to musical education, to sports and recreation? And in that school board battle, we have perhaps the most clear-cut definition of Žižek's theory of fantasy. And here's why. One of Žižek's contributions to Lacanian psychoanalysis is to essentially take the idea of fantasy and to politicize it. And another word for politicized fantasy is, of course, ideology. And here's essentially how Žižek's theory of politicized fantasy works. Žižek says that the fundamental dilemma within Lacanian psychoanalysis is that we attribute to the other a more complete enjoyment than we have ourselves. In other words, if we cannot properly enjoy ourselves, if we are barred, if we are lacking, then we attribute to the other, to the imaginary other, a lack of this lack. In other words, we think that the other can enjoy more completely than we can. This is still within the realm of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Think about it. If you're a parent, for example, part of what gives you joy is giving your child joy because you imagine that they can enjoy it properly. Of course, the bind, this is a bind that Proust was already very well aware of. There's a crushing scene in Search of Lost Time in which the little girl receives a birthday cake for her birthday that she doesn't really want. And yet she knows that what she really wants is to make her parents happy. And so she pretends to like the birthday cake so that her parents will not become unhappy, which she knows means that next year she will get an even bigger birthday cake. And so you end up stuck in this impossibility of trying to fulfill the other's lack. Žižek says that this can also take on a political dimension. After all, think about it. If you are attributing to the other that they know how to properly enjoy, that they are not lacking, then strictly speaking, you end up in a relationship of resentment. Because now you believe that the other can enjoy in a way that you cannot. Which means that now you think that if you are lacking, then this must surely be the result that the other person has stolen your enjoyment. And so it begins as a kind of evasive tactic out of the double bind of the Lacanian bard subject. Namely, I cannot enjoy fully, and so I will project onto the other a lack of lack. Namely, a completeness by which their enjoyment means something, now turns into a form of ideological resentment, by which I suddenly have come to suspect that the reason I am not lacking is that they have stolen it from me.
It becomes like a zero-sum evaluation. I don't have something because someone else has it.
Yes, exactly. That's very well put. And if you look at the example of the school board, of course, this is exactly what's happening here, which is that the point of education should be that a child should have opportunities that you did not have. That a child should hopefully be able to live in a way that is better and more fulfilling than what you lacked. And yet that suddenly turns into, why does the child get to enjoy that which I am lacking? Why do I have to finance the child's enjoyment? And of course, the complete fallacy of this position is made manifestly clear when you expose the simple truth, which is that most children don't like going to school. And so school, the thing that for most children becomes in some manner the thing that they wish to avoid forever afterwards, becomes this ideological pain point by which an angry, let's call them mob, of free-thinking, voting school board members have decided that financing public education is a way in which they are being stolen from. Now, what's important to note here, and the reason I'm bringing this up, is that one of Žižek's main contributions, like I said, to psychoanalytic theory, is the idea that fantasy is political, that fantasy can be politicized. And what we're going to do in this class in the next 60 minutes or so is I'm going to try to explain what Žižek means by the idea of fantasy being politicized. Which of course means that we have to start with the idea of fantasy. Lacan has a really interesting take on fantasy. Lacan says that fantasy is fundamentally a defense. Fantasy is a defensive mechanism. However, fantasy is not a coping mechanism. Now, why is that? A coping mechanism would be the standard common sense idea of fantasy, which is that we find reality hard to bear, and that we choose to escape reality by means of diving into fantasy, whether it's through a subculture, whether it's through an imagined community, whether it's simply by binge watching whatever television series you enjoy. The idea being that going to work is the hard reality that you face, and that at the end of the day, you indulge in video games or movies, that this is like the fantasy that you choose to escape your lived reality. That's sort of the common sense take on what a fantasy is. Of course, by suggesting this kind of a binary between the real world and the world of fantasy, you already end up in a slightly reactionary position, which is to say that you suggest that the people who dabble in fantasy are somehow less real and therefore less deserving of real value, etc. This is something that you see, for example, within the academy, within academia, or within schools. The consistent assertion of this idea, especially from people who are no longer in school, that school is not the real world, that learning and knowledge is a kind of fantastical indulgence, and that sooner or later you will have to wake up from the world of ideas and enter into the world of reality. And this is a kind of like reactionary platitude that even Plato surprisingly upheld. Plato said that the professional hazard of being a philosopher is that because you have your head in the sky, you're more likely to fall into pits, both literal and metaphoric, of course. And to some extent, that's true, right? If you only exist in your head, if you only exist in the sky, if you only dabble in abstract concepts, then you do risk falling into metaphorical pits. Hannah Arendt once wrote about Heidegger, who of course notoriously, infamously dabbled in Nazism, that Heidegger was a fox who had fallen into a trap and confused it for a burrow. Goethe has a line about the fool. Goethe says that the fastest way to become an idiot is to have opinions by yourself. In other words, to just sit on your couch and read blogs and sort of have opinions without actually engaging in some kind of civic discourse and actually exchanging ideas with others. So of course, on a purely conceptual level, if you live in pure abstraction and ideas without the exchange of those ideas, yes, there's a certain threat of falling into the pit, as Plato says. Or as then Nietzsche would later say, that if you look into the void will look back at you, etc. And yet there's a reactionary element to this idea that education and learning, knowledge, is a kind of hedonistic fantasy, that it's something that you enjoy, but that at a certain point you have to let go of it in order to engage with the real world. Lacan's argument is that fantasy is never the opposite of reality. Lacan argues quite provocatively that reality is itself the ultimate fantasy. Now, of course, when you hear that reality is a fantasy, it sounds like a relativistic statement. It sounds like the kind of thing that somebody would say after consuming too many drugs. And yet what Lacan is trying to point out is that the problem of being alive is precisely that we struggle to live in the real world. That what should appear as hard reality to us has to be mediated through some level of fantasy. What Lacan calls the fundamental fantasy. The fundamental fantasy is that which underlies our participation in reality. And if you think about it like on a very common sense level, it's not really that hard to understand, which is that there are many instances, I think, in day-to-day life in which we can have sudden moments of almost uncanny unrealness. This is also why déjà vu should, strictly speaking, be counted as one of the many modes of the uncanny. Because if the uncanny is the process by which that which is alive appears to be dead, and that which is dead appears to be alive, in other words, inanimate objects appear to be animate, and animate objects appear to be inanimate, then what is déjà vu other than the process by which you take that mechanism, that contradiction between two states of being, and you apply it to the mode of time? A déjà vu is a process by which something which appears to you at first appears to you come to you at second hand. Something has always happened already. There are moments in which you experience déjà vu that are strictly speaking uncanny, in which you have a slight slip, what the Matrix would call a glitch, by which what appears as reality to you suddenly betrays the real, the hard kernel of truth underlying it, which is that reality is always pre-mediated by some form. And the pre-mediation that form takes is, of course, the form of fantasy. And so Lacan essentially argues that fantasy, rather than being the opposite of reality, is precisely what is necessary to be in reality. That you need to have some kind of fantastical framework of reference that allows you to properly embrace reality. And so the argument that you have to wake up out of fantasy to enter into the real world for Lacan is almost the exact opposite. It's saying that the only way to enter and access the real world is precisely to be within fantasy as such. And so it should be clear to you, hopefully, that Lacan isn't arguing that there is no such thing as reality. You know, reality is the ultimate fantasy. It's not just a platitude about some ethereal, absolute, ideal state. It's precisely saying that it's because reality is real that we have to embellish it with fantasy in order to access it. Now, of course, we have to go a little bit further here. This is just the beginning. Because Lacan then makes a slightly more difficult argument. Lacan says that fantasy is a defense mechanism, as I said before. All fantasy is defense. Well, if fantasy is defense, then you should probably ask yourself, it's a defense against what? Well, what is fantasy a defense against? Fantasy, and this is where it becomes a little bit technical, fantasy is a defense against the idea that reality requires fantasy. In other words, if reality, the idea of reality unmediated by fantasy, is the ultimate fantasy, then fantasy is a defense against the realization of this truth. And we're going to take that idea and put it aside for a moment. We'll get back to it a little bit later. Because we have to talk about desire. That's probably the best way to approach this. The metaphor that I use is usually to think of you're in a photo studio and you can light the subject from different angles. And depending on how you light the subject will appear differently to you. So let's say that we've backlit the subject by means of talking about fantasy as a defensive mechanism. Let's front light the subject by means of talking about the idea of castration. And then we'll have a backlight and a front light. And then maybe we can add like a side light, a key light or whatever. We're adding the key light right now. Castration is the key light. I'm getting lost in my metaphor here.
Yeah, it's not front light.
Yeah, front light, key light, whatever. It's not like we all have degrees in cinematography. Okay, so Freud versus Lacan. Very simple distinction that we're going to talk about by means of talking about Dragon Ball Z. One of my favorite, actually not Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball. If you go back to the beginning of Dragon Ball, first of all, what's great about Akira Toriyama's work, especially his older work, whether it's Dragon Ball or I forget what it's called, the thing that he did before Dragon Ball, which is about a little girl. Someone in the comments will know. It's a little girl. Is a lot of the humor is very perverted. Like, and what I mean by that is it's not strictly speaking sexualized, but there's a lot of like Freudian humor in it that I think is like inadvertent. For example, the first comic that he does, one of the recurrent gags is poking at one's poop or other people's poop with a stick and stuff like this, and gifting poop. But there's a scene in Dragon Ball very early on where Goku, young Goku at this point, meets Bulma. And there's a scene in which Bulma is asleep. And Goku is, you could say, exploring the idea of sexuality. And what's very important here is that this is pre-sexual exploration. So it's important to note that the old man in Dragon Ball is a pervert in that he's very interested in Bulma's sexuality as a woman. Goku is interested in sexuality because he doesn't know what a woman is. Very different distinction. And so Goku, while she is asleep, in a sense, does something very violating, which is that he raises her skirt. And he's extremely frightened. This is a great panel in the comic early on in Dragon Ball. It might be like in the very first Dragon Ball. And Goku is like traumatized, properly traumatized in a very Freudian sense, which is that he has realized that Bulma does not have a penis, that she does not have a male sexual organ. And he doesn't know what to do with himself. This is a very shocking moment in the original Dragon Ball. And it's beautifully rendered, like the way it's drawn is like he's really terrified by this realization. But here we have one of the key differences between Freud and Lacan. For Freud, the castration complex is about the fact that the woman doesn't have a penis. Surprise, surprise. For Lacan, the castration complex isn't that the woman doesn't have a penis. It's that the man realizes that the woman doesn't have a penis and then has to do something with this knowledge. And so there's a very slight shift in perspective here that is oh so important. And this is sort of what Lacan does repeatedly to Freud, is that he takes a Freudian insight, which by itself is a bit banal, and he shifts the perspective without contradicting it and finds a whole nother level in it. For example, I've mentioned this before, Freud versus Lacan's theory of anxiety, which has to be related to the castration complex. For Freud, anxiety is the separation from the object of desire. The primordial object of desire is the mother. This means that for Freud, the child, who then becomes an adult, wants to be rejoined, unified with the object of desire. And so the original loss is constitutive. Lacan accepts this premise, but again, slightly radicalizes it. Lacan says that, yes, loss, primordial loss, is the beginning of desire, which is constitutive to the subject. And yet Lacan says that if desire is desire for desire itself, then we don't want to be reunified with our object of desire. In fact, what makes us anxious isn't the loss of the object of desire. What makes us anxious is the loss of desire itself. And so the closer we get to reaching the object of our desire, the more anxious we become, because we realize that there might be nothing behind it. See, I've explained this before, but now you can see how like Lacan takes Freud's idea and he doesn't refute it, but he simply draws out its more extreme consequences. And this is something that Žižek has argued about all philosophers, which is to say that the progression of the history of philosophy never works by means of refutation. In this sense, it is strictly speaking quite different from the scientific process, which progresses by means of refuting what has come before. Within philosophy, it's not a process of refutation, but it's a process of going beyond the logical conclusion that the other thinker couldn't reach. And so you take the kernel, the progression of one thinker, and then you think that to its logical conclusion. That's the progress of philosophy. Something that I think a lot of students miss, which is not their fault, it's usually their teacher's fault, which is the teachers present philosophers as having different points of view.
As being in opposition.
As being in opposition. And so students think, which philosopher should I side with? Who has the best answers? Who makes the least mistakes? This is one of the problems within Bertrand Russell's, for example, introduction to the history of philosophy, is that he simply takes different ideas from different thinkers and weighs them against each other as if one person had more good things to say than the other. And this limits the kind of process of development, which I've always argued is akin to what Günter Grass called Krebsgang. Krebsgang is a German expression for how crabs walk, which is to say that crabs walk not by means of moving forward, they move by means of moving sideways. And the movement of the history of philosophy is a sideways movement. It's not a full frontal assault to the idea of truth. Anyway, this is a digression. We should get back to Goku realizing that Bulma does not have a penis. And so the original idea that Freud has is that castration complex primarily describes, if you will, quote unquote, a woman problem, which is that she does not have the thing. Lacan says that we have to go a lot further, which is that it's not so much about woman doesn't have penis. It's about what does man do when he discovers woman does not have penis. And of course, what man does is he has to supplement this lack with fantasy. And what is a fantasy that man supplements the lack with? It's to say that if woman appears to me as incomplete, I will paradoxically elevate woman to the symbol of completeness. In other words, now I've reverted, instead of saying she is lacking and I am not, now my penis becomes the symbol of lack in order to uphold her completeness, which is mediated by the symbol of that which she is no longer lacking. A constitutive negativity. Instead of saying she has absence of penis, she has become complete because she has no absence of absence. I don't know. It's a complicated.
She doesn't need a penis. Well, you covered this really nicely actually when we were talking about the abortion decision.
Sorry. We're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you talked about the abortion decision and Lacan's theory of sexuality and difference.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
This means that Lacan's definition of fantasy is that which obscures the lack in the other. And so if the castration complex is the process by which the man obscures the lack in the other, in the female other, not by disavowing the lack, not by saying, oh yes, she has a penis, pretending like the woman is a man, but instead to suggest that the only way to make her lack not lacking is to suggest that the penis that you have as man becomes the symbol of lack. And this is why the way in which I usually describe the castration complex is in the following terms. First of all, the castration complex relates to the phallus and not to the penis. Why is that? The phallus is the imaginary relationship to the penis. Now, by means of discovering that the woman has no penis, she has something which is nothing. This nothing has to be elevated into some kind of something, into completeness. Which means that the penis thereby has to be rendered into the opposite of completeness, i.e. absence or impotence. And so the penis suddenly becomes the signifier, not of potency, but of impotency, which is the name of the phallus. The phallus is the imaginary symbol of the penis as absence of potency. Which explains the patriarchy a little bit, but that's like a whole nother...
It's a different class.
Yeah, okay. And so, let's take it a step further. If Lacan, and I know this is all difficult, but we're taking it step by step. If Lacan says that fantasy obscures the lack in the other, then fantasy is the veil against castration. Fantasy is what we use to veil the problem of castration. And now, I know I'm going very fast here, remember this is the last class. Now we're actually very close to understanding two of Lacan's most difficult ideas. One, there is no sexual relationship, right? Because for Lacan, it's not a binary between woman has, I'm going to be very crass here, the whole, and man has the shape that fits in the whole. It's not a binary of sexual exchange. Instead, it's almost a relationship of non-relationship, which is woman doesn't have what I have. Thereby, I have to elevate that which woman doesn't have into a symbolic completeness, thereby relegating my thing as a sign of non-thing. It's almost a complete reversal of the idea of a whole that you put something in. Now the whole exists within man. And what has to be put within man? It's woman. Woman is now that which makes man complete by obfuscating the lack, by projecting lack of lack onto woman. Sorry,
you're right. You said it better.
No, please.
No, it was great.
Now, here we have the very treacherous overlap between love and hate, between fixation and resentment. Because if love is the process by which you say that the other person isn't lacking, right? The idea that I lack, but the other person isn't lacking, then you realize that the same thing applies for hate or resentment, which is the other person has stolen my enjoyment. The other person has that which I cannot have. And love, and this is Zizek's theory of love, but it's not just his, it goes back all the way to Plato. Love, in this sense, is precisely what steals your enjoyment. Žižek's theory of love is quite simple. It's you're going through your day-to-day life. Everything's fine. until suddenly you're struck by lightning. You fall in love. And it's very inconvenient because now the things that used to give you joy seem hollowed out. The person has suddenly become your favorite hello and your most hated goodbye. Unless you're with them, you're not truly happy. The things that you used to like doing by yourself now seem not that fulfilling. Love in this sense is an inconvenience. Of course, it's also an invitation to enrich your life and to open up yourself to the other, etc. But life disrupts the unity of self that you are experiencing. Life takes what you appreciated as enjoyable solitude and it suddenly renders it into existential loneliness.
You mean love. You said
Love.
life.
No, love. Sorry.
Okay,
love.
that's okay.
But here we understand the relationship that Freud already identified between love and hate, which is that if love is the process by which I attribute a non-lack to the other, namely the other person knows how to properly enjoy things, and by means of being with the other person, I too can properly enjoy things, then hate is the process by which you say, well, because the other person has no lack, because the other person can properly enjoy, because I've projected the impossibility of enjoyment onto the other, now I can resent the other because maybe they've taken what I had originally. This is one of those things that you see within couples when they fight, is this idea was, I was fine before I met you, and you ruined my life because you made me fall in love with you. I mean, think about it. This is like the structural line of misogyny that runs throughout Western literature, is the idea that you should beware women because they will ruin men. The temptress who brings the man into an existential metaphysical plane,
Distraction.
a distraction without which he would have been complete. Of course, this entire fantasy is designed to veil the traumatic knowledge that the man has, which is that the only way to avoid the absence of phallus in woman is precisely to elevate the woman to the level of completeness, to she who is not lacking, which means that the sign of what was supposed to be my thingness, namely the penis, has now become a sign of my absence, of my lack, which is the phallus.
Yeah.
I know this is all very technical,
no.
but
And I was gonna say, I know that you weren't gonna do.
Sorry,
like
I interrupted you again. Start over.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
you know.
I know that you weren't gonna do a class on the patriarchy, but I think it's important to point out here. This is also why it's so perverted to, how can I say this? The sexualization of young girls, because it's not giving high heels and makeup and glitter nail polish to a little girl is making them sexualized. It's saying that by giving them these things, it is making them complete woman.
Right.
And that reinforces the patriarchy. The problem isn't that it's overly sexualizing them, although that is an aspect, an element of it. The problem is that it's saying, with all of these things, aren't you lucky little girl? You can be complete woman with these things.
Yeah.
You are already complete woman with all of these, socially, all of these gifts in a sense.
I don't want to get into like the realm of like trans identity on this, but one of the things that I find really interesting, even within writing about, this is very difficult to balance, even within writing about trans identity, and for example about Caitlyn Jenner, is this idea that maybe the ultimate patriarchal fantasy is not just to have woman, but to also become woman.
To be able to be woman.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think we talked about that a couple of weeks ago with cross-dressing.
Yeah.
In the bonus. Anyway, sorry, I didn't want to say it.
We can get back to that a
really
little bit in the
interesting.
bonus discussion that we do
Yeah.
later after class, but it's really interesting. So to get back to the formula, the technical thing, which is that if fantasy is what sustains desire, right? In order to desire, we require fantasy. Fantasy is what allows us to have an imaginary investment in the symbolic framework of desire. If fantasy sustains desire, and the traumatic insight that a woman is lacking in penis would be the elimination of desire, now you understand why fantasy becomes a defensive mechanism. Fantasy is what sustains desire against the castration complex. If the castration complex is that which undermines our certainty, namely the certainty of desire, then fantasy is what keeps the castration complex at bay in order to sustain desire. Now, to get back to what I was going to say before, is the image that I've always used, if you will, the metaphor for the castration complex, is to see it as being the opposite of the phantom limb syndrome. Phantom limb syndrome, as most of you will know, is when someone has lost the limb and believes it is still there. Castration complex is the exact opposite, which is the thing is still there, and it's precisely because it's still there that I feel like I have lost it. And so instead of saying woman doesn't have a penis, but she thinks there should be one, it's precisely saying I have a penis, but I feel like I don't have one. And this is also, I don't want to go too deep into this, no pun intended, but like Lacan when Lacan talks about castration complex, he talks about the difference between frustration, privation, and castration. A lot of people misconstrue the castration complex as being about frustration. For example, when somebody says, oh, people who drive big cars have small penises, this is castration on the level of frustration. The idea being that you physically have a small sexual organ, and therefore you are compensating by means of buying things that's supposed to represent alpha maledom, etc. Or vice versa, that a man's confidence is supposedly linked to the size of his penis. This is penis as not phallus. This is penis as you are making an argument about a direct representation between the size of the sexual organ and between psychopathological behavior. For Freud and then for Lacan, it's almost the opposite because it's not a conscious relationship, it's an unconscious relationship. It's not frustration, it's castration, because you're not acting despite the size of the member. You are acting as if the member didn't exist. But I don't want to go too deep into that. But I think it's an important thing because I think within our culture it's become commonsensical. It's become like a common trope to talk about things like spending money or buying big cars as being a compensation for having a small penis, which of course is a bit of a defensive mechanism, but you know what I mean? And for Freud and Lacan, this would never make sense. This is never how it would actually work. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about the pervert, because you mentioned the word perversion, and we've talked about perversion before, and now we can kind of string it all together. And this is where I don't want to force people to take notes, but if you take notes, you can start piecing it together. If fantasy is what sustains desire, and fantasy is a veil against castration, namely a veil against the knowledge of the absence in the other, suggesting that the other is complete so as to thereby project my absence onto someone else's completeness. Or to put it more simply, if fantasy is what sustains desire, and fantasy is a veil behind which the castration complex is hidden, the pervert is simply the person who loves the veil. The pervert is the person who doesn't love the thing behind the veil. The person is the one who loves the veil. Which is to say, the pervert isn't the one who loves, in this case, the woman. The pervert is the one who loves the defensive mechanism against woman. And the example that I have here, and I used it a couple weeks ago, which is to say that when young people, could be adults too, put up a sexualized poster on the wall, a dancer, a stripper, a singer, something like this, a hypersexualized image. Or even, if you will, perversion within hentai culture. It's never that they're putting this on the wall because it's a sign that what they want to do is walk around and have sex with everybody.
It's not a sign of their sexual maturity.
Exactly. It's not a sign of their sexual maturity. It doesn't mean I want women so much that I need to have them on the wall. Instead, once again, it's almost the exact opposite. It's a defensive mechanism. I am so afraid of engaging with the other sex that the best way to keep the reality of sexuality outside my frame of reference is to have it on the wall. Because it's safe. If I have boobies on the wall, it means I don't have to touch real boobies, if you will.
It's sort of like having a spider in your room. If you can see the spider, you know where it is and you're safe. But as soon as the spider disappears and you no longer see it, like that's when you're most under threat,
Yeah.
in a sense.
Exactly. Yeah, you could be walking around and suddenly be accosted by women's sexuality, which would potentially discombobulate you, or worse, make you fall in love. I mean, I'm projecting the misogynistic narrative we had before. And so the easiest way to be safe from woman is to have the pinup of a woman on the wall. And it's interesting to me because I think that there's a lot of, like, to go back to Zizek's idea. Remember, Zizek's idea was simply that fantasy, if fantasy is a defensive mechanism, which sustains desire and veils castration complex. If fantasy is a political mechanism, we can draw a really dark conclusion from this same mechanism, which is the conservative argument had always been that, you know, people who play violent video games are more likely to commit violent acts. That people who put sexualized images on the wall are more likely to commit acts of sexual violence. First of all, even if an act of sexual violence were committed, it wouldn't be a consummation of a sexuality that was put on the wall. It would be a repressed, pathological, perverted, and I'll explain in a moment why, explosion of that which had been repressed. Namely, if the sexualized image on the wall isn't a sign of your desire for sex, but a sign of your hatred for sex, which is, again, your resentment of sex, namely that which is not lacking, that which I'm keeping at bay by means of putting it on the wall. If you fall in love with the barrier towards sex, it means you fear sex, which means you start to resent sex because you think that sex has something that you are lacking. In other words, we found a very direct link between the idea of the incel and the anger and the violence of the incel and the person who supposedly has the hentai on the wall, etc. And so the idealization and the fetishization of woman becomes the hatred of woman. And you only understand that once you understand that the idealization and fetishization of woman is a defensive mechanism against woman, not a celebration of woman.
Yeah, and I think that that's also why there's this troubling element where incel culture also seems to go hand in hand with chivalry in terms of I've treated women so nicely and yet women disdain me.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of like, what they don't realize is that chivalry is upholding the patriarchy in a sense.
Well,
I don't want to get too
No, I'm really glad that you
deep into
mentioned chivalry, because this is exactly how Hegel talks about chivalry as part of Sittlichkeit. Chivalry isn't designed to bring you closer to the other. Chivalry is designed to keep them at a comfortable distance. Chivalry is precisely the imposition of a symbolic barrier, a set of norms by which you are supposed to act so that you never actually have to confront the reality of who the other person is. And look, it's not bad to be polite. It's not a bad thing to hold a door for somebody, even if that other person is a woman. The problem and the complaint is that by means of this imposition of this formality, you have also created a formal barrier. By which, of course, you realize the internal power dynamic, which is that if suddenly the woman holds the door for you, suddenly you feel like something has happened within that relationship, which is then experienced as a threat. And so Sittlichkeit is the expression through civic interaction of the symbolic order, but it also means that the best way to fight against Sittlichkeit is never to simply say, I'm going to fight the system. It's to say, I'm going to participate in the system from the other angle, which specifically is not to say women should be doing the same jobs as men, equality is liberation, etc. It's precisely to show the hollowness of those actions by means of revealing the hidden structures within them. This sounds too academic-y. I don't mean to make it sound like that. The point that you were making is that chivalry, as part of incel culture, oh, I love women so much, I respect them.
I elevate them, I put them on a pedestal.
Yeah. Functions according to the same inner logic as I put sexualized image of women on the wall, essentially. So the point that I was trying to make is that if we're talking about the political element within fantasy, and the attribution of the sexualized image of woman on the wall as being not, I want sex, but rather I want a defensive mechanism against sex, leads to a resentment against women, which is women have this thing which I now fear, or I resent, or I no longer have access to. We can make a very troubling link from that to the cultural violence that we experience, for example, with school shootings. One of the things that happens whenever there's a school shooting is there's always this quest as to the motives, right? Why would somebody do this? And for a long time, like from the 1990s onwards, cultural conservatives would argue that and this is the standard conservative take, which is that anything bad that happens is a sign of a decline in moral standards. And so a school shooting would be a sign that the youth are engaging in amoral activities that have corrupted their soul from within. For example, the idea of playing violent video games, watching violent movies, or listening to rap music, or Marilyn Manson. And it's interesting, Marilyn Manson's response in the Columbine documentary, in which he was asked about this by Michael Moore, Marilyn Manson, who's supposedly the shock rocker guy, gives the most liberal answer, humanistic liberalism in a nutshell, which is, he says, instead of asking me why the boys did it, why don't you ask the boys why they did it? This is also a dead end. The worst person to ask why you did it is precisely the culprit. And this is what Žižek means ultimately when he says that, and we'll get to this at the end of the class. Žižek says that it's important that if fantasy is a part of political behavior, if ideology is a kind of systematized fantasy within political mechanisms, then the ultimate fantasy is to think that you could eliminate that and go to the truth. What is the originating motive? What was the moment in which the shooter decided to do it? What was his real cause? Žižek says that one of the things that we have to do is what he calls, we have to resist the hermeneutic temptation, which is both a metaphysical argument and a political argument. The metaphysical argument is, strictly speaking, that in the divide between essence and appearance, which Plato posits, that the Hegelian insight is that essence and appearance aren't necessarily opposite, but that essence emerges only in appearance itself. In other words, we shouldn't be looking behind the veil. Lacan writes about this in terms of Parasios' veil. Parasios has this, it's essentially the myth of Parasios, by which two painters, one of them a demigod, the other one a mortal, have to paint a painting. Zeuxis and Parasios. And Parasios essentially tricks Zeuxis. I think I'm saying this correctly. Both of them have to paint a bunch of grapes. And Zeuxis paints a bunch of grapes that are so realistic that the birds start pecking at them. And he says, look, this is the most realistic painting. It's the ultimate illusion. Even the birds think it's real. Parasios asks Zeuxis to come into his studio. And he sees a veil covering the painting. And in his desire to see the painting of the grapes, he pulls at the veil and realizes that the painting is itself the veil. That the veil was painted. There is nothing behind the veil, no false grapes, no essence of grape. There's only the veil. And this is more real. The veil contains the truth of grape, which is that there is no essence of grape. There's only veil. That the veil is more truthful than that which is supposedly hidden behind it. That's Lacan's metaphysical argument, which builds upon Hegel's argument that the so-called Kantian turn, by which you put emphasis on subjective reason over the idea of pure reason, or you investigate the conditions under which reason can access the pure, which is a contradiction in terms. After all, what is the critique of pure reason other than the idea of a paradoxical thing, which is purity, the absolute, the ideal, the form, mediated through reason? In other words, it's an argument about how you can find reality only through fantasy, namely through subjective mechanized reasoning processes. That's the metaphysical argument Žižek has when he warns against the hermeneutic temptation. The political argument Žižek has is that whenever something bad happens in the world, something traumatizing, we try to explain it away because it's comforting for us to know the underlying cause. We put together panels of experts who talk ad nauseum about what just happened because in some pathological process, we think that if only we can find the underlying root cause, we can make the problem go away. When the truth is that we can't make the problem go away, but we can make it feel like it has already gone away because we've talked about it enough. This is the problem when we talk about the so-called national conversation. National conversation it's the ultimate liberal humanist trope, like Marilyn Manson, let's just listen to the boys. The more we talk about something, the less likely we are to come to a truth. Because the truth is that it's precisely because we cannot define what it is that we have to have the society. Adorno said that the definition of a society is that which cannot be properly defined. Any national conversation that would lead to one overarching culminating idea that has explained away the problem of the pathological existence of violence within society would thereby have eliminated society. And so the idea and the desire for a national conversation isn't bad. Of course, we should stimulate the exchange of ideas and communication and civic exchange. But the desire for a national conversation is precisely the desire to not have to confront the problem head on, which is that perhaps this kind of violence is precisely part of society, that violence isn't barbarism, that violence is civilized. This is the traumatic truth about the Holocaust, is that the Holocaust, which is in schools presented to us as the epitome of barbarism, was in fact the industrialization, the mechanization, the civilization of slaughter. That's what we fear about it. It wasn't that it was this random act of excessive, irrational violence. It was that it was too rational, that it was premeditated, that it was clinical in its execution. That's what makes it, the Holocaust, the ultimate horror. It's not the amount of people who died. It's the fact that violence became civilized within it. And of course, within the civilization of said violence, we find the ultimate act of horror and barbarism. They're not opposites. Barbarism is made manifest precisely within civilization. Something that Benjamin and Adorno wrote about as well, and Brecht had jokes about, is what kind of barbarism is there other than civilization? Think about colonialism being the civilizing force that takes us around the world and brings enlightenment to the people, etc. Brecht's joke, what is it to rob a bank compared to founding a bank, could thereby be linked to the idea of civilization. What is it to be a barbarian other than to create a civilization? Okay, enough about that. The point here is that I was talking about gun violence and how it relates to the idea of the fetish and how it relates to the idea of repression and fantasy and the veil. Gun violence is never saying, I have this violent fantasy that I now wish to execute. I have a desire to kill, and now I will execute this desire in reality. It's almost, again, always the exact opposite, which is to say that reality is kept at bay. Social reality is kept away. In the same way that the pervert avoids sexual engagement by means of a highly sexualized image, the shooter, I don't want to like pathologize everybody here, but the shooter, the violent fundamentalists, whatever you want to call them, essentially keeps violence away by raising violence to this ethereal, explosive thing. There's no other way. This is one of those paradoxes, which is that if you think about what violence is, it becomes almost impossible to commit violence. The only way to commit violence is to make violence a non-violent act. For example, Žižek has, and it's very provocative, but Žižek has talked about, like, for example, within Buddhism, and this is a simplification, Buddhist fighters, in part who were used by the Japanese army, had this idea that they weren't wielding the sword, but they were the sword that was being wielded by the powers that be. And this is the stance of the pervert for Žižek, and he takes that from Lacan. In the formula that Lacan has for the pervert, the formula is barred subject to object. That's usually how it works, which is I'm a barred object, and I've posited the completeness of the object in order to... Anyway, we don't have to go all the way there. The formula of the pervert isn't to say, I want the object of desire. It is to say, I am the object of desire of the other. And so instead of saying, I am the one who wields the sword, you say, I am wielded by the sword. And now you see all those manifestos from shooters who are saying, I am now in a position in which... This was so interesting about the recent shooting, of course, devastating, but was very interesting about something that the shooter said in one of his YouTube videos, was to say that I am at a point of no return. Even I could not convince myself. Even I can't stop myself. That is the moment of perversion. That is the click by which now it is not I who am wielding the gun. The gun is wielding me. I have been put in this position in which it is impossible for me to not act. That is the moment of explosive violence. It's not saying I have gun and I've decided to use it. It's saying I don't have gun. I am fundamentally completely powerless. I am the symbol of impotence, and therefore gun has me.
And that's why, I mean, I think it's important to take a step back and say gun ownership should be regulated, precisely because we can't resolve gun violence by means of addressing every individual's sense of powerlessness and the idea that violence will resolve whatever issues they have. The idea is to take guns away from people. And that's not the sorry, I'm incoherent about this issue because I I find it so frustrating. They're two different conversations.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're incoherent at all. I think it's a difficult topic, and I think we can talk more about it in the bonus. This is essentially what makes gun phallic in that precise sense, which gun is supposed to be the thing that represents power and safety, and yet it becomes a symbol of the absence of it, right? Okay, I want to wrap up here because we're stitching together a lot of things. And I really do appreciate your thoughts. We can definitely talk about it more in the bonus. For those of you watching, we always host a bonus Q&A with our patrons afterwards, which you can also download as a podcast if you're a patron. That's a little plug for that. And it's $5 a month, so it's like the minimum amount that we can charge. I'm going to end on something, which is this. This lecture series has been called The Useless Precaution. And I want to attempt a very quick explanation of what I mean by the useless precaution. Lacan's theory of the subject is that the subject lacks. And what does the subject lack? He lacks nothing. And the problem is that all of the things that the subject thinks will fill in his lack will invariably fail because they can only offer him something. And if what you are lacking is nothing, then something won't fill that. And the problem with the objects of desire is thereby the difference between the aim and the goal. Lacan says that the aim and the goal is that the aim is what you think you want, but the goal is the underlying reason why you want. If you will, it's the difference between the objet as the object of desire and the object cause of desire. The object of desire, your aim, is what you think you need in order not to be lacking. The object cause of your desire is what you need in order to keep on lacking. In other words, the thing that you want has to be sustained in its want, which means that you have to find a way to never properly achieve it. This is also ultimately why the fundamentalist is a pervert who tries to circumvent this problem. If the pervert is the person who says, I am not chasing the object of my desire, instead I am the object of the other's desire, then you've elevated the other to a kind of master figure, be it God, be it, I don't know, my partner, be it my children. As soon as you said that the only reason that I exist is to fulfill the desire of the other, you found yourself in a very pleasurable position, which is the position of now I can enjoy life, because now I'm not chasing some empty object. Now I found a matter in which I am the empty object. And this like disemboweling of subjectivity from within on behalf of an ultimate sublime master figure other is the position of the pervert. It's the inversion by which you say, it is not I who am chasing the thing, it is I who am the thing. And elevating, and this is why it's precisely elevating yourself to the position of the thing, is what Freud calls the totem. Namely, as we talked about last week, the monarch. Who is the person who is the object elevated to the notion of the thing? It's the king, the person you cannot touch, the person who is a mere mortal and yet somehow is above mortal life. This is also why Lacan, as we said last week, Lacan says that the sublime is the object elevated to the level of the thing. Think about it. If the object is the thing that you are chasing, and the pervert is the person who says that rather than chasing the object, I am now the object, which is the object of the other's desire, then you've elevated the object to the thing, which is now you, which is engaged with the sublime. And so the fundamentalist is the pervert precisely because the pervert acts on the level of the sublime, which is the elevation of the object to the level of the thing. I know this sounds super abstract, but like all of this was in the previous class, so hopefully it'll like link up. Which means that if the subject lacks, the subject can't be lacking in something. Because if the subject was lacking in something, then that something could be filled and the subject would no longer be subject. And so the subject has to be lacking in nothing, and nothing counted as something, constitutive negativity. And the ultimate traumatic core, the real underlying this, remember, the imaginary is related to fantasy. The symbolic is related to the governing order in which the fantasy can be played out, namely desire. So symbolic is on the level of desire. Imaginary is on the level of fantasy. In order to keep that turning, like the cat and a piece of and a slice of peanut butter toast that revolve around each other because the cat always falls on its legs and the peanut butter toast always falls on its face. In order to maintain that constitutive tension between the imaginary on the level of fantasy and the symbolic on the level of the symbolic on the level of the symbolic order, what you need is to keep on desiring. And this is like, every once in a while I make a TikTok video and someone, understandably, not blaming anyone, confuses Lacan's theory of desire with a Buddhist statement, which is, what we have to do is we have to eliminate desire. And if we eliminate desire, we will be fulfilled. For Lacan, nothing could be less true. Eliminate desire and you've eliminated the subject. So as soon as you've eliminated subjectivity, it means you no longer have desire, and vice versa. And so the subject, because the subject doesn't exist a priori, the subject doesn't exist in essence, there's nothing behind the veil, there's no subject behind the veil, and the veil of fantasy, this means that the only way to access the subject is within the veil. The essence of the subject emerges within appearance itself. What is appearance? Appearance is fantasy. What is fantasy trying to cover up? The traumatic insight in the core of the castration complex. And so this means that subjectivity, rather than being something pure that you can find once you've eliminated desire, that it lies behind desire, you find the core of subjective truth. That is itself the ultimate fantasy. That is the illusion that keeps the clock ticking. And so Lacan says that as long as you don't scratch away at the fundamental fantasy of there is a true self behind pathological fantasy, you have access to the subject. And so, to go back to Žižek, Žižek has a very unusual argument about psychoanalysis. Žižek says that the goal of psychoanalysis should never be to eliminate fantasy, to go beyond fantasy. And Žižek often uses the term traversing the fantasy, which is something that Lacan mentions, but he doesn't mention it frequently. And for Lacan, it's never traversing the fantasy, it's specifically traversing the fundamental fantasy. Now, what does it mean to traverse the fundamental fantasy? The fundamental fantasy is precisely the fantasy of reality. The fundamental fantasy is the fundamental fantasy of a subjectivity detached from fantasy. And so how do you traverse the fundamental fantasy? Precisely by realizing and embracing that subjectivity is itself something which appears after the fact, that appears only within the impossibility of subjectivity. That subjectivity happens after the fall. You fall into fantasy, and within fantasy, subject emerges. And the fundamental fantasy is that subjectivity has to be rid from fantasy in order to be subject. And the truth is precisely that there is no truth behind that. The truth is precisely, the secret of psychoanalysis is precisely that subject only appears within fantasy. And once you've thereby traversed the fundamental fantasy, namely the fundamental fantasy of subject without fantasy, then you are capable of managing and coping the manner in which fantasy works in your life. Then you have access to actually an emancipated subjectivity. You are able to think about how you would like to act. You are no longer acting on the pathological denial, the foreclosure, which is also the disavowal of the idea that you need to strip yourself of fantasy in order to reach subjectivity. And so subject lacks. What does the subject lack? The subject lacks nothing, which means that it can never be fulfilled by something because something can only offer something which is nothing. Now, if you're not following, that's totally okay, because we've done a 12-week series, and you can download all of the materials, if you want, as a patron, because this is super technical. We've worked our way up 12 weeks to get to this point. And so Žižek's argument is always to take a political argument, on the one hand, which is to say that if fantasy is the process by which we project onto the other a completeness, which is supposed to make up for our incompleteness, then we end up resenting the other. Žižek has been very strongly criticized, understandably, for his take on immigration, for example. Žižek very strongly critiqued liberals and leftists who talk about immigration as being like one block of people, of humanity, and that we have to demonstrate our humanity by taking them in. And Žižek was essentially arguing that by treating migrants or immigrants as an actual block, we are, in fact, falling prey to this very idealization of the other as being not lacking. It's a very interesting example I had in my own life in this, which was I was talking to, this was about a group of refugees from Syria. and a friend of mine had taken in a family and was in Germany, and the Syrian refugees were living with them. And they said one of the curious things about living with these Syrian refugees was that they refused to consider themselves as Syrian refugees. They always said, no, 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 those are the other people. We're not those people. We're above those people. And so if they wanted to say, like, okay, let's take you to like thrift shopping, let's take you to a Goodwill and buy cheap clothing, they'd say, no, 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 that's what refugees do. We're not refugees. Of course, this avowal is a necessary survival strategy, part of being a refugee. The other people are refugees, I'm not a refugee. And yet it's precisely the liberal humanists who insist on the refugee. And Žižek makes the extremely provocative argument that this follows the same logic as the Jew within the Nazi fantasy, which is to say, how do you suggest Nazism? It's by suggesting a completeness of the Jew, capital J, who invades every part of society. This imaginary, mythical fantasy of the Jew is not that the Jew is lacking, but that the Jew is complete, and that the Jew has completely taken over. And so that the imposition of completeness onto an imaginary other is a political fantasy that is fundamentally reactionary, even if it presents itself as being holistic, humanistic, and good. That was Žižek's argument. It's understandable he was critiqued for it, but when you break it down, that is in line with his argument, which has always been to say, let's take Lacan's theory of the fantasy and make a political assumption about it. And the final point I want to make here, because I know we've gone 10 minutes long, is ideology for Žižek is simply that which gives us a preordained, prepackaged fantasy. After all, ideology, if you think about it, if the premise is that we cannot inhabit reality except by mediating it through fantasy, then ideology is what gives us a prepackaged fantasy, a framework by which to inhabit reality. It's also why Žižek, again, very provocatively compared Pokemon Go to what the Nazis did apropos the Jew, which is when you play Pokemon Go, you're holding your phone and reality appears to you mediated through the phone, and now you are in the park because you are finding the Pokemon hidden in the bushes. It gives you this superimposition of an extra frame, a fantasy frame, that allows you to more properly engage with reality. And so everybody was excited. Oh, the children are going to the park, and we've convinced children to go outside again because now they're hunting Pokemon. Žižek very provocatively says that's how the framing of anti-Semitism worked for the Nazis, which was to say, yes, reality is bland. It's just bushes and parks. But behind every bush and every park, there could be the Jew. And that this insertion of the fantasy frame by means of a political ideology, which is a prepackaged set of political prejudices, is precisely what suggests that reality is complete, which makes up for our nagging awareness of the real, which is that reality is incomplete and has to be supplemented by fantasy. And if you supplement reality by the proper pathological ideological fantasy, which in this case was a reactionary anti-Semitism, you can suggest that reality is complete, and you can hide and obfuscate the fact that the subject mirrors the emptiness of the real, which is the emptiness of reality. And that is what makes the fantasy suitable to political ideology. That's Žižek's argument in a nutshell. And so, if you remember the last ebook that we did, the previous lecture series was called Where Nothing is Lacking. The subject is not where nothing is lacking, but where what is lacking is nothing. And so we've completed the arc. We've completed the picture. We went from where nothing is lacking, constitutive negativity, to subjectivity, which is a negative constitutive, which is not where nothing is lacking, but where nothing is what lacks. The subject lacks nothing. That wasn't very elegant, but Jenlene will edit it to be more elegant.
I know what you mean.
All right, that was super technical, but really fun. I want to say thank you guys. We've done a lot. We covered the pervert, we covered fetish, we covered disavowal, we've covered Žižek, we've covered shootings, sexualization, incels. We've done so much. It's been a wild ride. And that was just today. That was today. So if you'd like to go back and download this entire lecture series, which is 12 weeks, it's an entire course on Žižek's take on Lacan, starting with week 1, working our way up to week 12. You can find that now on Patreon as an exclusive digital download. Or you can also watch them all for free on YouTube or Instagram, IGTV, because every class here is open access. Jenlene and I are both 100% committed to open access education. Like, that's the dream. The dream isn't to sell ebooks online. That's also why we delete the ebooks after 3 months. Like, we just want to keep moving forward. The dream is to make open access philosophy and theory and psychoanalysis available to everybody. And by means of participating in these classes, you are making that dream come true. So thank you guys so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to teach this series, The Useless Precaution. Of course, by now you know what the useless precaution is. The useless precaution is precisely the idea that you could find true subjectivity, that there is a true subject behind the veil of fantasy. A useless precaution that is very fruitful in that sense. And all the lectures are organized on YouTube and on Instagram, courtesy of Jenneling.
They should be in playlists.
They're in playlists. And if you'd like to support these classes and join our bonus Q&A or download our podcast, if you'd like to download the ebook, 5 Keys to Žižek, which is available for another 10 days or so until the end of July, please head over to Patreon. Every little contribution both helps us keep going and will hopefully enrich you in your learning process. So on behalf of myself and Jenneline.
Thanks for starting your week with us. I hope everyone has a wonderful week. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting us. It really does mean a lot to us. And we should see you next week.
And for those of you who are already patrons or who would like to join, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to host a Q&A on Discord, which we're also going to post as a podcast for patrons. So 5-minute break, and then we're going to go. We're going to go live on Discord. Plus next week, next Monday, as per usual, we're going to start a new lecture series. So if you'd like to join us for a new lecture series... I'm not going to be here
next week.
Not next week. Okay, next week we're going to do the book launch then. Jelleen's going to take a break next week. Jelleen's going to go to a yoga retreat, a much-deserved break, which for me would not be restful, but I know for you...
That'd be the opposite of restful for you.
But I do enjoy yoga, but I don't think a yoga...
You don't enjoy retreating into yoga.
If I went to a yoga retreat, it would be like that Fleabag episode, I think. Like, I have a vibrator that like keeps going off from the bedroom. I'm like, no, this is for work. I'm trying to make a point about Lacanian Drive. Anyway, thank you guys so much. It's truly been a pleasure and a privilege to spend this time with you. Our only goal is to hopefully honor your intelligence by not trying to dumb this down, by really just trying to be real with you, by trying to make this hopefully as stimulating as possible. So on that note, thank you guys so much. We love you, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.